I'm a descendant of Standing Rock. My grandfather was born out there and came as a young man. And so I had heard, the stories, and I'd met aunties from the reservation, and was just always very fascinated by that branch of my ancestry. And as I grew older and more of us in my family did what we could to learn about our Native heritage, one of the stories was about one of my mom's cousin, Elsie, who went missing and was later found. They said she had committed suicide, but the family always said she was murdered. So go back to 2017. I had just completed my first year in the Minnesota House of Representatives, and that summer I was listening to a report coming from Canada on their missing and murdered Indigenous women's task force, and that was the first time I'd really heard about a task force around this issue. And I listened to what they had done and the stories of families and survivors, and of course was brokenhearted. That was the same summer that Savannah Fontaine Graywin went missing, and her body was found in the river up in North Dakota. The infant that she had been carrying had been cut from her womb. Her body was thrown in the water, and it was later found that the neighbors had tricked her into going up to their apartment, and they were the ones that stole her baby from her and just discarded her body so brutally. And even though we heard that she was missing kind of like through Facebook and social media, we weren't seeing that on media, like on the radio or on the television at all, until her body was found and they found the child had been cut away. So that's with that sensationalism, all of a sudden, the media just glommed onto it. And, that's kind of been the history of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. The media doesn't really pay attention to when that happens. So North Dakota started to create some legislation around addressing the issue of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And just so that you all have some historical context, MMIW means missing and murdered Indigenous women. But we know it's not just the women and girls, it's the boys and the men in our two-spirit, our LGBTQ community, that for hundreds of years just disappear and nobody ever finds out what happened to them. There's a lot of jurisdictional issues. There's a lack of interest in the police for Native justice. And one of the things that we found out in the report that did not surprise us at all was that even though American Indian women and girls make up just 1% of our state's population, between the years of 2010 and 2018, 8% of all murdered women and girls in Minnesota were American Indian. And from in any given month during the years of 2012 and 2020, anywhere between 27 and 54 American Indian women and girls in Minnesota were missing. So those were not surprises when our task force found that out, but we didn't have that data to begin with. So I realized that if South Dakota was going to do that, then it was important that Minnesota jumped on board and did the same. And so I came back to the legislature and we put together a skeleton bill. And then I reached out to our Native community, as many women that I knew, and asked them to join me in reviewing the report or the legislation, and to invite any other women, because I really wanted this to be a bill that they created, that is coming from the Native community, especially the women and the people that work with the violence against Native women. And they came by the dozens, I mean, literally, and helped craft that bill. They were the ones that decided who would participate, who was not necessary to participate, and how they wanted it. They wanted to make sure that it was the voice of the Native women, of survivors, of family members of survivors, of those that work with this sex trafficking and violence against women. And we created that legislation. And we weren't able to pass it in the next legislative session, even though we did introduce it. Extremely emotional. All the legislators on both sides of the aisle in the House pledged to support it, but we couldn't get the Senate to pass on it, to pass it off of their floor. And so we brought it back the next year. And we worked really, really hard. I mean, we had folks calling the legislators, both the House and the Senate. The first year there were postcards made, and we shared those again and just really told the stories. And fortunately, we had Chair Mariani on our Public Safety Committee in the House that made sure that that was a priority. And they just couldn't, they just couldn't ignore the stories. We did get it through the House and the Senate that year, but we were given a very small amount of money and 18 months to get it done. And I have to say that we did it. We did it in those months, and the report came out this past December. And we'll have to have Nicole Martin tell you from her side of the project, because Nicole really spearheaded this and really made all of the difference and put it together. And so that's where we are. This year I introduced legislation to create a MMIR office, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives office here at the legislature, in the state government, for employees. Again, a pretty lean budget. And it passed, of course, in the House, no problem, but we never got a hearing in the Senate, even though Sheila Lamb on here very serendipitously got to present it in public safety when they weren't quite ready for it. But I put it as an amendment on a bill, and we still haven't gotten it done, but I'm hopeful that with a little bit of pressure from the public and from other folks here at the legislature, we might get it done this year. If not, I'll bring it back next year, because it's so important that we continue this work in a way that is, people will be held accountable, and we'll have to be sure that it's going to happen.